My daughter told me I was embarrassing at the dinner table in front of 11 people I had known collectively for 43 years, and then she told me to be quiet. And when I continued to finish the sentence I had been in the middle of, she reached across and placed her hand flat on the table in front of me in the way you stop a child from touching something dangerous. And she said, "Papa, that is enough." The sentence I had been finishing was about wine, specifically about the difference between a wine that has been given time to become what it is and a wine that has been rushed to market before it has had the chance. I had been making this point in response to a comment her husband Renaud had made about the estate, about the commercial direction he believed we should be taking, about the partnership arrangement he had proposed 3 times in the past year, and that I had declined 3 times without apparently making the declining sufficiently clear. The dinner was in the dining room of the estate house, the house I had lived in for 29 years, and the 11 people around the table were our oldest friends and neighbors from the surrounding domains. People who had known me since before Celine was born, people who had known my late wife Marguerite, people for whom this house and this table represented something that had been accumulating meaning for a generation. Celine looked at me across the table with the expression she had been developing over the past 4 years, an expression that combined impatience with a species of pity that I found more difficult to receive than the impatience. She was 40 years old, and she was beautiful in the way Marguerite had been beautiful, which is to say fundamentally and without apparent effort. And she was intelligent in the way Marguerite had been intelligent, which is to say quickly and with edges. And she was wrong in a way that Marguerite had never been wrong, which is to say, without the quality of doubt that good intelligence usually carries. I looked at her. I looked at Renaud, who was looking at his wine glass with the expression of a man managing his satisfaction at an outcome he had not engineered, but that suited him. I looked at the 11 people around the table, who were looking at various points in the middle distance with the expressions of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable in someone else's family and who are doing the work of not having seen it. I set down my glass. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and placed it beside my plate. I pushed back my chair. The sound of the chair on the stone floor of the dining room was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. I stood up. I said, in the voice I use when I am being very precise about something, bonsoir. And I walked out. My name is Armand Leconte. I am 67 years old. I was born in Bordeaux in 1957, the second son of a cooperative owner who made barrels and understood wood the way some people understand music, which is to say, with a physical intimacy that has nothing to do with analysis and everything to do with accumulated presence. I grew up understanding that time and material and care were the 3 things from which everything worth having was made, and that the temptation to abbreviate any of these 3 things was the temptation that destroyed most of what people tried to build. I have owned the domain Leconte in the Saint-Emilion appellation since 1989, when I bought the 48 hectares of limestone plateau and clay slopes from a family that had lost the energy for the work. The domain had been in poor condition, the vines overcropped and the cellar equipment outdated, and the winemaking philosophy such as it was oriented toward volume over quality. I had been working as a consultant oenologist for a large negociant house in Bordeaux for 8 years by that point, learning the technical side of the wine trade at a level of detail that was useful, but that was also increasingly insufficient for what I actually wanted to do, which was to make something from a specific piece of earth that was worth the time it took to make it. I spent the first 5 years of the domain's rehabilitation living without the income that the previous owners had been generating, reducing yields drastically, replanting where necessary, rebuilding the cellar, and learning through the specific failure and success of successive vintages what this particular terroir was capable of when treated with appropriate respect. The learning was expensive and slow and entirely necessary, and I have never regretted a day of it. Marguerite came to the domain in the 4th year. She was a journalist from Lyon who was writing a piece about small-scale independent producers in Saint-Emilion for a regional magazine, and she arrived in a green Citroen that had a broken windshield wiper on the passenger side and a box of books on the back seat that suggested she traveled with her library. She tasted 6 wines, asked questions that demonstrated she had done her research, and wrote 3 paragraphs about the domain that were, in her opinion, fair and, in my opinion, the most accurate description of what we were trying to do that had appeared in print. She came back the following month for a second visit and the month after that. And eventually the visits became a permanent arrangement that formalized itself in 1995 as a marriage and has been the central organizing fact of my life ever since, including the 7 years since her death in 2017, during which her absence has been the organizing fact in a different key. We had 1 child. Celine was born in 1984 and grew up in the Domain house with the specific childhood of a child raised on a wine estate, which means she learned to recognize the smell of fermentation before she could read, and she understood what it meant when the sky had a particular quality in July. And she spent harvest seasons surrounded by adults who were simultaneously exhausted and entirely alive in the way of people doing the thing they were made to do. She was a brilliant student and she went to Bordeaux Business School on a scholarship she won on her own merits, and she graduated and worked for 4 years at an international wine trading company in London. And then she came home and joined the Domain, and for the first 3 years of her return between 2010 and 2013, it was the best period the Domain had experienced. Then she met Renaud Castel. Renaud was 36 years old, originally from Paris, and had made his way to Bordeaux through a combination of inheritance money from his grandmother and a series of wine-related business ventures that had, like many ventures, built primarily on the confidence of their promoter rather than the quality of the underlying product, achieved more surface than substance. He was well-dressed and spoke well and had the specific quality of people from a certain Parisian milieu, which is a quality of presenting the impression of sophistication so fluently that people mistake the presentation for the thing. He had an opinion about every wine he tasted, and the opinions were delivered with a confidence that covered their thinness with considerable skill. I disliked him within 20 minutes of the first meeting. I want to be honest about this because it is relevant to understanding everything that followed. The dislike was immediate, and it was professional before it was personal. He talked about the wine market the way consultants talk about industries they have studied, rather than the way people talk about things they understand from the inside. And when I made a technical point about the specific drainage conditions of our plateau parcels and their effect on berry concentration in hot years, he changed the subject with the smoothness of someone who has not understood what was said but does not want this to be apparent. Celine married him in 2015. The wedding was at the Domain, and it was a beautiful event, and Marguerite danced at it with the specific joy of a woman who had been worried about her daughter's happiness and was temporarily relieved. And I danced too, and I set aside the professional dislike because the professional dislike was about Renaud's relationship with wine, not about his relationship with my daughter, and the latter was what the day was about. Over the following years, the professional dislike expanded to include its personal dimension. Not dramatically, not through any specific incident in the first years, through the slow accumulation of small things that individually did not constitute evidence and collectively constituted a pattern that I found impossible to ignore once I had seen it clearly. The pattern was about the Domain. More precisely, it was about what Renaud believed the Domain represented and what he believed it should become. He had, from the first year of the marriage, been interested in the commercial possibilities of the estate in a way that was disproportionate to his actual involvement in the work of making the wine. He attended business meetings and he had opinions about pricing and distribution and the export market. He did not work in the cellar. He did not participate in the vineyard work. He did not understand the specific decision-making that goes into the production of a bottle of wine from the moment the vine flowers in May to the moment the cork goes in after a period of élevage that in our case runs between 18 and 22 months. He understood the wine as a product. He did not understand it as a process. He also, in the years between 2015 and the dinner in October, proposed on 3 occasions a restructuring of the domain's ownership that would give him, through a combination of a partnership agreement and a revision of the estate's corporate structure, a formal role in the governance of the business. Each proposal was framed differently. The first was about tax efficiency. The second was about generational transfer planning. The third was about investor readiness, which is a phrase that means the preparation of a business for the introduction of external capital, and which, in the context of what Renault was proposing, meant the transformation of a family domain with a specific philosophy into an investment vehicle with a different set of priorities. I declined each proposal. I did not decline them dramatically. I declined them clearly and with explanation, explaining what the domain was and what it was not and why the distinction mattered. The proposals kept coming because the declines did not register as final. This is what I understand now about Renault that I did not fully understand at the time. He had classified my resistance as the conservatism of an older man who would, with sufficient patience and the right approach, eventually be persuaded to see reason. He had not classified it as a principled position reached after 40 years of understanding the specific thing that was being protected. This misclassification was his fundamental error. The dinner in October was not about wine, except in the sense that everything at the Domaine Leconte is about wine, which is to say, it is about time and patience, and what becomes possible when both are applied consistently to something that deserves them. After I walked out of the dining room, I went to the cellar. The cellar of Domaine Leconte is a long stone structure that extends under the house and under part of the northeast garden, and it contains the current vintage in barrel and the library of older vintages in bottle, and it has a temperature and a quality of quiet that I have found over 29 years to be the most reliable environment available to me when I need to think clearly. I went to the part of the cellar where the 2015 is stored in bottle, the vintage from the year of Celine's wedding, which is one of the finest we have produced, and I sat in one of the old wooden chairs that are down there for the purpose of sitting and thinking, and I sat there for approximately an hour. I was not angry in the way that people are angry when they have been blindsided. I was something more like resolved in the way that decisions that have been forming for a long time and that have been waiting for a specific moment crystallize when the moment arrives. The moment had arrived and the decision had crystallized. I went to my study and I called my lawyer, a woman named Isabelle Arnaud, who had been handling my legal and estate affairs for 16 years and who understood the domain structure with the intimacy of someone who has helped build and maintain it. She answered on the third ring, which meant she had seen my name and had understood that I would not call at 10 in the evening unless the call was necessary. I said, Isabel. She said, Armand. I said, I need to restructure the succession arrangement, the domain's ownership structure. I need it done correctly and comprehensively, and I need to understand the timeline. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will be at the domain tomorrow at 9. She came at 9. She was 53 years old, a small, precise woman from Périgueux, who had the quality that the best lawyers have, which is the quality of making the complex simple without making it less accurate. We sat in the study for 3 hours. I told her what I wanted, and she told me what was possible, and we mapped the difference between those two things until the gap was closed. What I wanted was this. I wanted the domain to continue as it had been operating, which meant as a family property making wine according to principles that I had developed over 30 years and that were worth making wine according to. I wanted this to continue after my death in a way that was protected from the specific kind of pressure that had been applied to it over the past several years. I wanted Celine to inherit the domain because it was hers by right of family and by right of the work she had done in it. I did not want Renault to have any formal role in its governance now or in the future. And I wanted the structure to reflect these intentions in a way that was legally sound and clear. Isabelle told me what was available. Under French agricultural law, there were several instruments relevant to the protection of an agricultural property from unwanted changes in governance and ownership. The Groupement Foncier Agricole, or GFA, was one. A structure that places agricultural land in a collective ownership vehicle and that includes provisions about how decisions affecting the land are made and who can make them. She also outlined a specific instrument in the succession law for agricultural estates that was relevant to my situation, which she described in the technical language of her profession and that I will translate here as a mechanism by which I could designate Celine as the inheritor of the operational estate while specifying conditions that protected the estate's agricultural character and governance philosophy. We worked through the details for 3 hours. By the time Isabel left, there was a plan. The plan would take approximately 3 months to implement fully through a series of steps that each had to be executed in the correct sequence to produce the intended result. I spent those 3 months in the normal rhythm of the domain. The harvest had been completed in September, and the wine was in barrel for its first winter. I had work to do the regular winter work of the winemaker, the monitoring of the barrels, the decision about the timing and frequency of racking, the assessment of which barrels were performing as expected and which would need attention. I did this work. I also did several other things. The first was that I began a systematic documentation of the domain's history, its practices, and its philosophy. This is something that exists in my memory and in scattered notes and in the institutional knowledge of the people who have worked here for many years, but it had never been formally assembled. I assembled it. I spent 2 hours every morning for 6 weeks at the desk in the study, at the writing in the plain, clear French that Marguerite had always told me was the thing I did with language that she admired most. I described the terroir of each parcel and the reasoning behind our vineyard management practices. I described the winemaking decisions and the philosophy that generated them. I described what a good vintage of Domaine Leconte represented and why it represented it and what would need to remain true for it to continue representing it. I titled the document simply Notes on the Making of Wine at Domaine Leconte, 1989 to the present. The document ran to 112 pages. When I had finished it, I had it professionally printed and bound in 4 copies, and I placed one in the Domain archive, one with Isabel, one in the library section of the cellar, and one I kept in the desk drawer where I keep things that are important. The second thing I did was to have a series of conversations with the people who work at the Domain. There were 7 of them. 2 full-time vineyard workers who had been with me for more than 20 years, a cellar master named Jean-Pierre, who had been with me for 16 years, and without whom the quality of our wine in the past decade would have been significantly lower. 2 seasonal workers who returned each year for harvest and who had become, through this repetition, part of the fabric of the place, and 2 people who handled the administrative and commercial work of the estate. I met with each of them separately. I did not tell them what I was planning. I told them what I wanted them to know about the domain's situation and its future. And I listened to what they wanted me to know about their situations and their futures. These conversations produced a clear picture of what the domain required in the way of human continuity and what arrangements I needed to make to provide it. The third thing I did was to buy a small apartment in Bordeaux. This was the step I had been most uncertain about because it required a decision about whether I was prepared to move to leave the Domain house after 29 years, and the answer to this question turned out to be simpler than I had expected. I was prepared, not because the house did not matter to me, but because the Domain was larger than the house, and my relationship with the Domain did not require living in the house to be maintained. I could make wine from a house anywhere in the appellation. I could walk the vineyards every morning, regardless of where I slept. The house was a structure that organized a life, but the life it organized was made of things that were portable, of things that... The apartment was on the Quai des Chartrons in the wine merchant quarter of Bordeaux, in a building that looked out over the Garonne. It was smaller than I needed and considerably smaller than I was accustomed to, and it was in the city rather than on the land, and it was, for reasons I cannot fully articulate except to say that it felt right in the way that important decisions sometimes simply feel right exactly where I needed to be. The legal restructuring was completed in the middle of January. Isabel called me on a Tuesday morning to confirm that the final instruments had been filed. I thanked her. She said, "Armand, are you certain about all of this?" I said yes. She said Celine will challenge it. I said she can. I said it will hold. She said it will hold. She said I just wanted to ask. I said I appreciate it. On the following Friday, I called Celine and asked her to come to the domain for dinner. She came alone, which meant she had spoken to Renaud and had decided to handle this particular conversation without him. This told me she understood that something significant had happened and that her instinct about how to approach it was sound. We ate in the small dining room. Not the large one where the dinner in October had been the small room that had always been the family room, the room where Marguerite and I had eaten with Celine on every ordinary evening for years. I had opened a bottle of the 1998. It was the vintage of the year Celine was 14, the year she had stood in the cellar for the first time during a barrel tasting and had described with the vocabulary of a teenager who had absorbed knowledge she did not yet know she had exactly what she was tasting and why. It was a beautiful wine. It was 26 years old, and it was exactly what it had always been promising to become. She tasted it. She said the 98. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You always open this when you want me to pay attention to something." I said yes. She said, "Then I am paying attention." I told her. I told her everything. The restructuring, the documents, the GFA, the succession plan, the apartment. I told her in the same order in which it had been assembled, which is the clearest order. And I told her, with the accuracy that I had always tried to bring to important communications. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had from Marguerite. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked at her wine. She said Renaud is going to lose his mind. I said I expect so. She said he already knows something has happened. He has been asking about it since October. I said I know. She said he is not going to let this go easily. I said the structure will hold Celine. Isabel designed it for exactly this situation. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Papa, why are you moving out?" I said, "Because I have lived in this house for 29 years and I would like to live somewhere else for a while." She looked at me. She said, "Is that the real reason?" I said, "It is one of the real reasons." She said, "What are the others?" I said, "Because I think it would be better for the domain for there to be a clearer distinction between where I live and where the domain operates. And because I think that as long as I am in the house, certain dynamics will continue that do not serve either of us well." She understood this. I could see her understanding it. She said, "You mean Renaud treating this as his house?" I said, "Among other things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Papa, I am sorry about October." I said, "I know." She said I should not have done that. I said no. She said he had been pushing me about the proposal for weeks before the dinner. He said if I could not get you to agree to it in front of the guests to show that you were unreasonable about it, that we should consider other options. She stopped. I looked at her. She said I am telling you this because you deserve to know it. And because I understand now what those other options were. I said, "What were they?" She said he was talking to a lawyer, not Isabel, another lawyer, about whether there were grounds to challenge your management of the domain, to have you removed as the decision maker. On grounds of... She stopped again. I said, "On grounds of what?" She said he used the phrase cognitive decline. He had been making notes, things you had said or done that he was characterizing as signs of incapacity. I sat with this for a moment. I poured more of the 98. I thought about Jean-Pierre in the cellar, who had worked with me for 16 years and who understood my thinking about wine as well as anyone alive. I thought about the 112 pages. I thought about Isabel. I said he was collecting evidence that I was not competent to manage the domain. She said yes. I said while he was eating my food and drinking my wine at my table. She looked at the table. She said yes. I said, "Celine." She looked up. I said, "This is not about you and me. This is about what he is." I said, "I want you to hear something clearly." I said, "The domain is yours. It will be yours when I die fully and unconditionally with the protections that Isabel has put in place. What it will not be is his. Not in any form that gives him governance or commercial control. That is not a punishment. That is an appropriate reflection of what he has contributed to this place and what this place requires. She nodded. She was not crying. She was thinking in the way she thought, which was quickly and without apparent emotion, and with the emotion visible only afterward in how she sat. She said, "I need to make a decision about my marriage." I said, "Yes." I said, "I am not going to make it for you, and I am not going to tell you what to make." She said, "I know." She said, "I have been making it for a while." She said October was. She stopped. She said October was the moment I understood that the decision was already made. I just had not said it out loud yet. I said, "Take the time you need." She said, "Papa." She said it in the way she had said it when she was small and wanted to ask something that she thought might have an answer she did not want to hear. I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you still love me?" I looked at her. I said, "Of course I love you." She said, "Even after October." I said, "Love does not have conditions of that kind. It has limits, which is different. You found a limit on the evening you put your hand on the table in front of me, but the love does not have a condition attached to how you behave in it." She nodded. She drank some of the 98. She said, "It is very good." I said, "It is ready now?" She said, "It has been ready since before that dinner." I said, "Yes." She said, "You were waiting?" I said, "I was waiting for you to be ready." She was quiet. She said, "I am ready now." I said, "I know." I moved to the Bordeaux apartment in February. The moving was uncomplicated because I had been living in the Domain house for so long that I had accumulated the specific density of objects that a life accumulates. And deciding which of those objects should come with me required a serious assessment of what I actually needed versus what I had simply been carrying, because putting things down requires a different kind of attention than picking them up. I took the things that were mine in the specific sense, the books I actually used, the tools of my work, the photographs, a few pieces of furniture that had been Marguerite's and that I wanted near me. I left the house furnished and operational because Celine was going to need to live in it. Renault's response to the restructuring arrived through his lawyer in early March. It was exactly what Isabel had predicted, a challenge to the succession arrangement on the grounds that I had not been acting in full cognitive capacity at the time of its preparation. Supported by a set of notes he had compiled over the preceding year, documenting what he characterized as signs of deteriorating judgment. The notes were detailed, and they were built from genuine observations, specific conversations, and decisions that he had observed and that he had reframed in the language of decline. I read them once, which was enough. Then I sent them to Isabel with a note that said, "We have the 112 pages." The 112 pages, the document I had spent 6 weeks writing, the systematic account of the domain's philosophy and practice and history, written by a man who was by any technical measure in full possession of his faculties and who had demonstrated this through the quality and precision of what he had written. The document had been composed at the kitchen table of the study at Domaine Leconte between 6 and 8 in the morning over 6 weeks in November and December. And it was the single most cogent professional document I had ever produced. And it had been produced in exactly the period during which Renault was documenting what he claimed was my cognitive decline. Isabel brought in a physician to review the document and provide a formal assessment of the cognitive capacity of its author. The physician's report was 9 pages and concluded that the author demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought, sophisticated technical reasoning, comprehensive memory of complex subject matter, and the capacity for sustained analytical work that was inconsistent in every particular with any recognized profile of cognitive decline. The report was filed with Renault's lawyer's challenge as Exhibit A of the response. The challenge did not proceed. Renault's lawyer advised him that the evidence he had compiled was insufficient to overcome the medical documentation and the quality of the contested instruments, and that pursuing the matter would cost considerably more than it would produce. Renault accepted this advice from what Celine told me with a quality of fury that was itself informative. I am writing this in the apartment on the Quai des Chartrons in April. The river is doing what the Garonne does in April, which is to run high and brown from the spring rains in the Massif Central and to carry on its surface the particular light of a spring afternoon in Bordeaux that has been described in poetry and painting for 4 centuries without being adequately described. Because the light of Bordeaux in spring has a quality that depends on the specific combination of the Atlantic to the west and the river and the pale limestone of the city, and it requires the thing itself to fully understand. I drove out to the domain this morning. I walk the vineyards every Thursday morning and have done so for 29 years with very few exceptions, and I am not going to stop because I live in an apartment in the city. The vines are doing what they do in April, which is to bud with the specific tentative urgency of things that have been waiting through winter and have now decided that the risk of a late frost is worth accepting. The buds on the Merlot are always slightly earlier than on the Cabernet Franc, and I noted this morning that the difference this year is approximately 4 days, which is consistent with last year but earlier than the 10-year average, which tells me something about the spring temperature accumulation that I will need to factor into the decisions of the coming summer. Jean-Pierre was in the cellar when I arrived. He gave me the weekly barrel report, which was good news. The wine is developing on schedule, and the early assessments of the vintage quality are in the range I had hoped for. We tasted from 3 barrels, and I made notes. Then I walked the parcels, noting what needed attention and what could wait. The parcels of the domain are as familiar to me as the rooms of any house I have lived in. I know every significant vine by its position and its character, and I know which slopes drain fastest and which hold moisture longest, and I know what the sky over each section looks like when a storm is coming from the southwest. This knowledge is not in a document, though I have tried to capture as much of it as I can in the 112 pages. It is in the body, in the feet that have walked these 48 hectares in every season for 29 years, and it is the kind of knowledge that cannot be transferred, but that can be demonstrated by what it produces. Celine was in the vineyard when I came back from the parcels. She was at the section we call the Plateau Hall, the highest part of the limestone plateau, where the drainage is most extreme and where, in very good years, we produce fruit of exceptional concentration. She was examining the bud break on a row of old Merlot vines that are among the oldest on the property. Vines that were planted by the previous owners before I bought the domain, and that have, through the combination of their age and the specific terroir of the plateau, Ho produced some of the most interesting wine we have ever made. She did not look up when I approached. She had her hands on a vine, feeling the wood the way her grandfather had taught me to feel it, with the same quality of physical attention that reveals what a photograph would miss. I stood beside her and I looked at the vine. The bud on the nearest shoot was approximately 3 millimeters, which was consistent with what I had seen in the lower parcels. She said without looking up, "The Plateau Ho is ahead of the slope." I said 4 days. She said I was going to say 5. She straightened and she looked at the view from the plateau, which in April in the morning is the view that I have found over 29 years to be the finest available to me in my life on ordinary days. The vine-covered slopes falling away to the valley below. The village of Saint-Emilion visible on its own limestone outcrop to the west, the light on everything with the quality of light in Bordeaux in April. She said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." She said, "Renaud left last week. He has gone back to Paris." I said nothing for a moment. I looked at the bud on the vine nearest me. I said, "How are you?" She said, "I am all right." She said, "I have been working." She said, "I have been working very hard and it is helping." I said, "Good." She said, "I read the 112 pages. I said, and she said, "I understood things about this place that I did not know. I did not understand." She said, "You should have written it years ago." I said, "I was not ready to write it years ago." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because writing something down fixes it. And I did not want this fixed. I wanted it alive." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now it is both." She nodded. She put her hands back on the vine. She said, "I think this row is going to be excellent this year." I said, "Yes." She said, the concentration in the plateau hoe in a warm spring is. She stopped. She said, you know what I'm going to say? I said, yes. She said, say it anyway. I said, in a warm spring with a dry June and an August that doesn't cook the fruit. The Plateau Haute Merlot produces something that has a kind of density and precision together that is not available anywhere else on the domain. She said, exactly. She was quiet. Then she said, I know how to do this, Papa. I said, I know. She said, I learned it from you. I said, and from your mother. She said, yes. She said, from both of you. We walked back down from the plateau together. The morning was doing what April mornings do in the Gironde, which is to be simultaneously the best morning you can remember and an entirely ordinary morning. And there is no contradiction in this, and I have spent 29 years being grateful for it. I will be in the cellar tomorrow morning for the barrel work. I will be on the plateau next Thursday. I will be in everything that matters at the domain for as long as the domain exists. The address where I sleep is a less important matter than the place where the work is done, and the work is here. In the vines in the cellar and the 112 pages, and the young woman with her hands on an old vine feeling what the wood is telling her. That is the domain. That is what was worth protecting. That is what has been protected. The 98 is in the cellar waiting to be opened again when there is something worth celebrating. There will be something worth celebrating. There is always something in the right year when the conditions have been right and the work has been done and the patience has held. And you open the bottle and the thing that has been becoming what it was always going to become fills the glass, and you understand one more time that the waiting was not nothing. The waiting was the work. Bonsoir. I want to add something about the dinner in October that the opening did not fully describe, because the opening described the moment of Celine's intervention, but not the full texture of the evening that preceded it, and the texture matters for understanding what had been accumulating for years. The dinner had begun at 7:30. Renaud had organized it, which was itself a shift from the established practice of the domain, where I organized the dinner occasions that involved friends and neighbors, and Celine organized the more social events. He had selected the guest list, consulted on the menu, and chosen the wines from the cellar, the last of which was a specific presumption that I noted without comment when he mentioned it. He had chosen to open 3 bottles of our 2012, which was not the wine I would have chosen for that company and that occasion. The 2012 is a wine that needs time and that in its current state is still closed and unrevealing. I would have opened the 2009 or the 2011. Wines that are ready to show what they are. The 2012 showed us something, but it showed us what it was going to become rather than what it was. And this is a different kind of showing. I noted this. I noted the guest list, which included 3 people who had commercial relationships with Renaud rather than personal relationships with the domain. One was a financial advisor from Bordeaux whom I had met once before. One was an export agent who worked primarily with large negotiant houses and whose business model was oriented toward volume. One was described as an investment consultant who happened to have an interest in agricultural property. These 3 people were seated on Renaud's side of the table. The old friends and neighbors of the domain were on my side. The conversation moved in the direction that Renaud had clearly planned from the beginning. His financial advisor asked in the early stages of the meal about the long-term commercial trajectory of the estate. The export agent expressed enthusiasm about the possibility of broader market penetration for wines of our quality. The investment consultant made a passing comment about the interesting position of small family domains in the current luxury goods market. Each of these contributions was framed as casual conversation, and each of them was a brick in the structure Renaud was building. I ate and I listened and I noted what I was hearing and I waited. I was not going to respond to the architecture of a conversation I had not been consulted about by becoming the person the conversation was designed to make me become, which was either an obstacle to be overcome or a man who could be persuaded in front of witnesses. I was going to eat the dinner and drink the wine and be present in the way that I was always present in my own home, which was with the patient attention of someone who had been doing this work for 30 years and who knew the difference between a conversation that was about something and a conversation that was being managed. I held this position through 3 courses, and then the subject came to me directly through Renault in the form of the proposal, not a new proposal. The same proposal, the third one, the investor readiness proposal, presented now at this table in front of these 11 people with a framing that made my continued refusal seem like the refusal of an old man to acknowledge change. I responded as I have described. I was in the middle of the response when Celine stopped me. The sentence I was completing was not defensive and it was not aggressive. It was accurate. I was describing the difference between a wine that had been given time to become what it was and a wine that had been rushed to market before it had the chance to do so. And I was drawing the parallel between this and the question of what should happen to a domain's commercial direction. And the parallel was clear and it was apt. And it was the correct response to the question on the table. It was a response that the 3 old friends and neighbors on my side of the table would have understood immediately, and that the 3 people on Renault's side of the table were intended to find difficult to refute without revealing the crudeness of their position. Celine put her hand flat on the table in front of me. She said, "Papa, that is enough." And I stood up and said bonsoir and walked out. The 3 months of preparation were also 3 months of living inside a situation that had not yet been resolved. And I want to describe what that was like because the description reveals something about what the domain is and what it does to the people who are inside it. I woke every morning at 5:30, which has been my habit since the early years of the domain, when the 5:30 waking was necessary to be in the vineyard before the heat of the day made the physical work difficult. The necessity is no longer there in the same form, but the habit remains, and I have kept it because the hour between 5:30 and 6:30. The hour I spend in the kitchen with the first coffee before anyone else in the house is moving is the hour in which I do my clearest thinking. It is the hour in which the previous day settles and the coming day assembles itself, and it is irreplaceable. During those 3 months, I used the early hour to write the 112 pages. I sat at the kitchen table in the study with the second coffee, and I wrote in the plain French that Marguerite had always appreciated, describing the specific character of each parcel of the domain, the specific decisions that had produced each significant vintage, the specific philosophy that had generated those decisions. Writing it required a kind of retrieval that I had not done before in this systematic form, a reaching back into 30 years of accumulated practice and experience and articulating what had been tacit, giving language to things I had always known through action rather than through description. It was the hardest and most satisfying writing I have ever done. I also continued to eat dinner with Celine and Renault on most evenings, because the alternative, which would have been to withdraw from the domestic life of the house in a way that announced the preparation underway, would have been both dishonest and strategically disadvantageous. I ate dinner with them and I was civil and I was not warm and I was not cold. I was present in the way I was always present, which was with the specific attention of someone who was observing and recording without disturbing. Renault spoke at these dinners about his plans for the domain in a way that had a quality of probing, as if he was trying to identify what I had decided and had not decided, and I answered his questions in the way that makes them unproductive, which is with accurate but incomplete information delivered without inflection. Celine watched these dinners with an expression that I came to understand over the course of those 3 months as the expression of someone who is beginning to see something that they had been not seeing for a long time. Not painfully, in the specific, careful way of someone who has been told to look at something under a microscope and who is adjusting the focus until the image is clear. The day Isabel called to confirm the completion of the legal instruments, I was in the cellar doing the morning barrel work. It was a Tuesday in the middle of January, and the cellar was at its winter temperature, which is cold, but not damaging the cold that keeps the wine slow and careful in its development. I had my phone in my pocket and I felt it vibrate, and I looked at the screen and saw Isabel's name, and I completed the barrel I was working on before answering because the barrel needed completion and because the call could wait 30 seconds. When I answered, she said, "It is done." I said, "All of it." She said, "All of it." I said, "Thank you, Isabel." She said, "Bonne chance." I said, "Ce n'est pas la chance." Elle said, "No, you are right. It is not luck." I went back to the barrel work. I had 3 more to complete before the morning session was finished, and I completed them. And by the time I came upstairs into the house for lunch, the legal restructuring of Domaine LeConte was complete, and the domain was protected in the way it deserved to be protected. The dinner with Celine in February, when I told her everything, was in the small dining room, and it lasted 4 hours. I have described the central exchange of it, but I want to describe the dinner itself more fully. Because the dinner was the thing that I think about most when I think about what the situation produced that was worth having produced. She arrived at the domain at 7, driving the small blue car she had been using since her own car went to the mechanic for a repair that turned into 3 weeks of parts waiting. She came in through the side door that leads directly to the kitchen, the way she had always come in as a child and as a young woman and as the person who ran the domain's vineyard operations. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment before coming through to the dining room. And in that moment, I could see her organizing herself, which is something she does that I have always recognized as her mother's habit, the specific internal arrangement before a significant conversation. I had set the table simply: bread and cheese and a cold terrine that Jean-Pierre's wife had brought from the village market. And the 98 opened an hour before she arrived because it needed the hour to open fully. The simplicity of the food was deliberate. This was not a performance dinner. It was a dinner for 2 people who needed to talk about something real. And real conversations benefit from food that does not demand attention. She sat down and she looked at the table and she said the 98. And I knew she understood that the conversation was serious because I only open that wine when the occasion deserves it. We ate for a while without talking about anything significant. She told me about a conversation she had had with a neighboring producer about the 2024 vintage prospects. She asked about Jean-Pierre's daughter, who had recently had a child. We talked about the bud break schedule and the forecast for the spring. These are not trivial conversations. They are the operational conversations of people who are inside a working agricultural system, and they are the natural language of anyone who has spent enough years at this domain to know that the vineyard is always the first subject and everything else is secondary. But they were also in this specific dinner the language of 2 people who were warming up to something. Then she looked at the 98 in her glass and she said, "You always open this when you want me to pay attention to something." And I told her. She listened in the way that she listens when she is listening fully, which is without expression, which is not the absence of feeling, but the suspension of its display in favor of complete reception. When I had finished, there was a period of silence that lasted perhaps 2 minutes, in which she held her glass and looked at the table, and I waited. Then she said, "Renaud is going to lose his mind." And we talked. We talked for 3 more hours. We talked about the domain and about what it was and what it required. We talked about Marguerite, who had been the 4th presence at every significant conversation I had ever had at this table, and who was present in this one too. In the way of people who are gone, but whose intelligence and warmth continue to shape the conversations of those who love them. We talked about what Celine needed now and what I needed now and how those 2 things could coexist in a structure that served the domain. We also talked about Renaud. We talked about him with the specific honesty that is available to 2 people who love each other and who are no longer managing each other's feelings about a third party. Celine told me things she had not told me before. She told me about the specific ways in which his relationship with the domain had affected his relationship with her. She told me about conversations she had had with him about the ownership proposals and about how those conversations had changed quality over the years from what had seemed like genuine discussion to something more like the management of an obstacle. She told me that the October dinner had been the culmination of something she had been watching build for more than a year, and that when she had put her hand on the table and told me to stop, she had done it because she knew what was happening and had believed in that moment that stopping me was the way to control what happened next, and that she had been wrong. And that she had understood this in the minutes after I walked out sitting in the dining room with 11 people and Renaud's satisfaction and the sudden clarity of what she had chosen. She said, "I chose him over you at my own family's table." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am not going to do that again." I said, "I know." The dinner ended at 11. She drove back to the main house in the small blue car. I washed up the plates and the glasses, including the 98 glasses which I washed by hand, because wine glasses of that quality deserve to be washed by hand, and because washing up after a good dinner is a form of care that I find satisfying in a quiet way. I dried the glasses and put them in the cabinet where the good glasses live, and I turned off the lights in the small dining room, and I went to bed. That is everything about the dinner. That is what the dinner was. The Bordeaux apartment requires description because it is a place I have come to love in the 4 months I have been living in it, and the love is of a specific and interesting kind. The Quai des Chartrons runs along the left bank of the Garonne in the historic wine merchant quarter of Bordeaux, the district that was for centuries the commercial heart of the Bordeaux wine trade, the warehouses and the courtiers and the negociant houses that built the trade and that gave the city its character and its prosperity. The buildings on the quay are 18th century in the main. Large and stone-fronted and serious in the manner of buildings that were built to accommodate commerce conducted at scale, and they have been converted over the past 40 years into apartments and offices and galleries and restaurants, and the conversion has been done in the building where I now live, with the specific care of people who understood what they were converting and why the original structure deserved respect. My apartment is on the 4th floor and it looks east over the river. The river at this point is broad, wider than you expect from the city streets, and it has the color and movement of a working river, which is to say it is not picturesque in the careful, deliberate way of rivers that have been managed for tourism, but simply present and active and indifferent to its own appearance. I find this quality of the Garonne, its complete indifference to whether it is admired, to be one of the most restful aspects of the view from my windows. I have been waking at 5:30 in the apartment, which is unchanged from the domain habit, and I have been spending the early hour in the kitchen, which faces the light well, rather than the river, and which is therefore the darkest room in the apartment in the morning, with a quality of quiet that is specific to urban early mornings, the quiet of a city that is not yet fully running. I make the coffee and I sit at the small kitchen table with it, and I think, which is the same activity I have always performed in the early hour in different rooms. The difference between the early hour in the apartment and the early hour in the domain house is specific and worth describing. In the domain house, the early hour had an ambient quality of the estate around it, the sense of the vineyards outside the windows, the cellar below the work of the day, assembling itself in relation to what was happening in the growing cycle. The early hour in the apartment is more purely interior. There is no growing cycle visible from the kitchen window. There is no cellar below. What there is the city beginning its day, and my own thinking with nothing external to organize itself around. This has produced a quality of thought that is different from the domain thought, less applied, more general. And I find I am making use of it in ways I had not anticipated. I have been writing in the apartment, not the 112 pages which is finished and complete. I have been writing something that is in an earlier stage of formation, a set of reflections on what it means to make wine on a specific piece of earth for a generation, on what you learn from doing one thing for a very long time, on what the relationship between patience and quality reveals when examined carefully. I do not know yet if these reflections will become something more formal. I am writing them because they are there to be written, and because the apartment provides the conditions in which they can be written, and because writing, I have discovered, in the months since the dinner in October, is one of the things that the life I am now living has room for, that the life I was living before did not. Jean-Pierre called me last week. He calls every Tuesday and Thursday with the Barrel Report, and on other days when something requires attention. He called on a Wednesday, which meant something required attention. He said the wine in Barrel 17 was developing a quality of reduction that was not severe, but that he wanted me to look at before the weekend racking. I drove out the next morning. We went down to the cellar together, and I tasted from 17 and from the adjacent barrels, and I made the assessment, and I told him what I thought we should do. He agreed. We racked on Thursday, and the wine came out clean. This is the ordinary work of the domain, the specific attentive management that separates wine that fulfills its potential from wine that does not. I drove back to the apartment from the domain on Thursday evening, and I sat on the small balcony that faces the river with a glass of the 2011, which is a wine that is at its absolute peak now and which will be at its peak for perhaps another 3 years before it begins its slow descent. And I watched the Garonne in the evening light, and I thought about the wine and what it represented, which was a vintage produced in the year that Marguerite's illness was first diagnosed, and in which the summer had been warm and the autumn had been late, and the fruit had come in with a quality of concentration that we had not seen in a decade. I thought about what the wine carried, that the wine itself does not know it carries, which is all of that year, all of that autumn, at all of the specific conditions that produced it, and I drank it. There is something that happens when you drink a wine. You made yourself from a vintage that is sufficiently old to have become fully itself, something that is not nostalgia exactly and not pride exactly, but a compound of both, along with the specific emotion of recognizing that what you gave to something came back. I had given 30 years to this domain, and the years had come back to me in a form I could hold in a glass on a balcony in Bordeaux in April. And the form was good, and I was grateful for it in the quiet way that I am grateful for things that have earned the gratitude through the actual work of becoming what they are. Bonsoir again. I'm going to finish the 2011, and then I am going to go inside and write for an hour before dinner. Tomorrow, I will be in the cellar. There is one more thing I want to tell you about a conversation I had in March with Marguerite's sister, Elise, who lives in Lyon and who calls me every month without exception and has done so since Marguerite died because she understood in the specific way of sisters who have watched their siblings' marriage for decades that the calls were the appropriate thing and that she would continue making them regardless of whether they were convenient. She called in March 2 weeks after Renault's legal challenge had been filed and before it had been resolved. I had not told her about the situation in detail, only in broad strokes, because the detail felt like information that would worry her to no good purpose. But she had understood the broad strokes with the specific comprehension of a woman who had watched her sister's family from a loving distance for many years and who had always had a clearer view of certain things than I had from the inside. She said, "How are you, Armand?" I said, "I am well." She said, "Tell me about the domain." I told her about the cellar, about the barrel work, about what I expected of the spring. She listened and asked the questions she always asked, which were the questions of someone who has been educated about wine over 30 years of visiting the domain and who has retained what she learned. Then she was quiet for a moment and she said, "And Celine?" I said, "Celine is working. She is running the vineyard operations and she is doing it well." She said, "Is she going to be all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And the marriage?" I was quiet for a moment. She said, "I am asking because I loved her as a baby and I love her now and I want to know." I said, "The marriage is ending?" She said, "I know." She said, "I have known for some time." She said, Marguerite knew too. She said it carefully, which is how she says things that she is not certain I am ready to hear. I said, "Tell me." She said, "In the last year, she used to talk to me about Renault, not in a dramatic way, in the way she talked about things she was thinking through carefully. She said she was worried that Celine had chosen him because she wanted to prove something, that she had chosen someone who needed managing because she was good at managing things. She said Marguerite thought the marriage was going to need him to change or it was going to fail, and she was not certain he had the capacity for the change. I said she was right. Elise said she usually was. We talked for another hour. We talked about Marguerite in the way we always talk about her, which is in the present tense, because there are people who continue to be active in the conversations of those who love them, and Marguerite is one of them. Elise said at the end of the call, "Armand, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it properly." I said, "I am listening." She said, "What you did with the domain, the legal protections, the restructuring, the document, all of it, I think it is the right thing. I think Marguerite would think it is the right thing." I said, "I think so too." She said she would also say that the important part is not the legal instruments. I said, "I know." She said, "The important part is the dinner in February." I said, "Yes." She said, you and Celine. She at the table telling the truth to each other. I said, yes. She said, that is the vintage Armand. That is the one that matters. I have been thinking about this since the call in March. I have been thinking about what Elise meant, which is what Marguerite would have meant, which is that the things worth making take the time they take and cannot be rushed, and that the patience required to let them develop is not passive patience, but the active patience of someone who is paying attention throughout and who knows the difference between the waiting that produces something and the waiting that is simply delay. The domain is what it is because I have applied this patience to it for 30 years. The legal instruments that protect it are the formal expression of that patience, but they are not the substance of it. The substance is in the wine and in the work that makes the wine and in the people who do the work. And in the relationship between all of those things and the specific 48 hectares of limestone and clay that they happen to be applied to. This cannot be captured in a legal document. It can only be demonstrated year after year by doing it correctly. Celine is going to do it correctly. I am certain of this. I am certain of it because of how she holds an old vine and what she reads in it, and because of how she tastes a barrel sample and what she hears in it, and because of the conversation we had in the small dining room in February when she looked at me across the table and told me the truth and asked me to tell her the truth, and we did. That is the inheritance, not the 48 hectares, though those are part of it. The inheritance is the knowledge of what the 48 hectares require and the willingness to give it. The Garonne is running high this week from the spring rains. I can see it from the balcony. It will run high for another 2 weeks and then it will drop. And by May, it will have the color and the pace of a spring river in the Gironde, which is the color of a good vintage in its third year in bottle, clear and lively and moving toward what it is going to become. That is enough. That is the vintage. I want to add one more thing about Marguerite, because Marguerite is in every part of this story, and I have not described her adequately. She was the person who understood the domain most completely after me, which is to say, she understood not just the wine, but the relationship between the wine and the work and the land and the years. And she understood this not from technical training, but from the specific intelligence of someone who pays very close attention to something for a very long time and who has the quality of mind that converts close attention into genuine understanding rather than accumulated data. She wrote a piece once for the regional magazine that had published the original piece about the domain, a piece about what it felt like to live on a wine estate through a complete growing season. She wrote it in the kind of French that is so clear and precise that it seems simple and that is actually very hard to write. She described the anxiety of bud break, when the vines are vulnerable and a late frost can destroy in a night what has been building for months. She described the specific feeling of walking the vineyards in July when the canopy is full and the vines are working and the air in the rows has a quality of deep green productivity. She described harvest, which she called the beautiful emergency, because it is both urgent and joyful and requires everyone to be completely present in a way that nothing else in the year does. The piece was published in September 2009, and it is in the Domain archive, and I read it every year in September at the beginning of harvest as a kind of orientation. Not because it tells me anything I do not know about the harvest, because it tells me how the harvest looks from the outside, which is something I have trouble seeing from inside it. She described the cellar in the piece as the place where time is stored. Not the wine, she said, time itself. The years of the domain going back to the first harvest, the years of the domain going forward to the last harvest that none of us would live to see. She said the cellar was the most honest room in the house because it contained nothing that was not what it actually was. I thought about this when I walked into the cellar on the night of the October dinner after Celine stopped me, and I stood up and walked out. I walked past the house in the dark and across the gravel to the cellar entrance, and I went down the steps into the cold and the quiet and the specific smell of stone and oak and the slow chemistry of wine developing in darkness. And I sat in the old wooden chair next to the 215 section, and I understood that I was in the most honest room in the house. Marguerite was right about this, as she was right about most things. The cellar contains nothing that is not what it actually is. The wine in the barrels is the wine the year produced. The wine in the bottles is the wine that vintage made and time revealed. There is no pretense in the cellar, and no management of impressions, and no performance of anything. There is only the wine doing what wine does when it has been made correctly and given the conditions it needs, which is becoming what it was always going to become. I sat in that chair for an hour, and I decided what I needed to decide in the most honest room in the house, surrounded by the time that had been stored there, and then I went upstairs and called Isabel. That is the full account. That is what happened. The domain is protected. Celine is in the vineyards every morning. The wine in the barrels is developing as it should. The apartment on the Quai des Chartrons looks east over the Garonne. The 112 pages are in the archive. The bonsoir I said as I left the dining room in October was not the end of anything. It was the end of a sentence I had been in the middle of when I was interrupted. I have been finishing it ever since in the cellar and the vineyard and the study and the apartment in the way that matters, which is the way of someone who knows what they are making and who is making it correctly and who is prepared to give it the time it needs. Bonsoir.